You are listening to Beyond the Checkbox, a podcast that focuses on leading strategies around bringing more mental well-being into the workplace. My name is Ryan Todd. I'm a psychiatrist and the CEO of Adversity. I'm sitting down with industry-leading changemakers to break down their process and see how they are going above and beyond for their workforce mental well-being. Good day, listeners, and welcome to Beyond the Checkbox, where we talk about all things workplace mental wellness. I am your host, Ryan Todd, and I am a psychiatrist and one of the founders of Adversity. We talked to Detective Art Wlodyka, who works in one of the busiest policing units in our country and faces all sorts of issues when we're talking about mental health. Namely, he works with people who have severe and persistent mental illness, and they're in a crisis. And he's one of the first people to go and try and de-escalate the situation and get that person to care. He talks about all the strains and the stressors of working in between the medical system and the police department and what that looks like. He talks about some of the wild situations that he finds himself in. He also talks about peer support and how we can help each other. And if he can talk about that as an officer, and he's implemented some of these mental health programs in his organization, we can learn a lot of really important lessons in our workplace about that. How do we take care of individuals who are in our most stressful and important positions? I'm really excited about the podcast today. Thank you for joining. And as always, subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And we are just launching season 3. So we're excited to have you for the whole season of Beyond the Checkbox. Great to connect with you. I want to hear more about your role. And so maybe let's just start there. Like, what does a day look like for you?
Yeah, so for me, I've been a police officer for 16 years now. I've spent the last decade primarily in mental health crisis response. So that's been focused around working with community nurses or community psychiatrists, going out kind of responding to people who are having some type of mental health crisis, either a neighbor, a family member, somebody's called in saying that their loved one is experiencing things that aren't real, or maybe they're thinking that there's lasers or things that are being pointed into their apartment, and nobody can kind of find the source of that. Or maybe somebody's feeling down, feeling suicidal, needs some additional help to maybe go to the hospital and get assessed and checked out. So that's kind of my main day job is responding to those types of calls and working with our uniformed patrol officers, working with our community mental health teams and the team at the hospital to just try to get people connected and the support that they need.
Well, okay. So your training was as a police officer.
Yeah. Yep.
And then how did this happen? How did you get into working? Like, you work exclusively in mental health now. Like, you're not chasing bad guys down anymore, are you?
Yeah. So for the last 10 years, basically working exclusively kind of in mental health. And yeah, I guess that kind of got started kind of fairly early in my policing career, just seeing kind of go into the same calls over and over again, the same 911 calls for people living in these tough situations, and feeling really disconnected from our community healthcare and not knowing what happens when we take somebody to the hospital, kind of drop them off for assessment, or maybe we wait kind of extended periods of time, and then sometimes would kind of see them later on in the shift and not really understand what happened kind of with the assessment and what was sort of the kind of the treatment program or follow-up kind of organized afterwards. And then, just kind of over years, just kind of going to more and more of those and wanting to, see if there was a different way. Is there maybe some way that we could see somebody just for themselves, for their family, when we're going to the same call, the same, the neighbors are calling, the family's calling, or they themselves are calling 7, 8, 9, 10 times in a week or sometimes in a day, and then feeling like we just didn't have the tools to kind of deal with them. Like, our options were kind of just take them to the hospital or leave them at home, or maybe make a phone call referral to kind of an unknown entity
Yeah.
for us. So just kind of wanting to kind of plug in and see that differently, and really just seeing a lot of people kind of just seeming like they were needlessly suffering, like just from a disconnected service, I guess is really kind of what it boiled down to.
Like it's either it's disorganized or like you're dropping patients off at the hospital. You don't really know what happens. I do a number of emerge shifts
Yep.
at a large hospital, and I feel bad for the officers. Like sometimes they have to, I mean, they sometimes stand around for their whole damn shift at the hospital, and that cannot be a productive use of their time. And the other thing I see is such a variance in how officers will treat someone with severe or persistent mental illness. Some are amazing, some are in between.
Yeah.
Maybe some don't have training.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I think that officers are more psychiatrists than psychiatrists are now in a lot of ways. And do you get the training? Like, do you get the training to work with someone who has severe or persistent mental illness?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The level of training, because I feel like the crisis de-escalation training, kind of right from starting at kind of the academy, is pretty good. A lot of kind of scenario based look at these behaviors without sort of the higher level of, diagnostic kind of knowledge of sort of the kind of the breadth of the symptoms and that sort of stuff, but just a basic understanding of certain behaviors and when someone's responding to an internal reality that's kind of not there. Okay, giving them space, giving them time, slowing down, our words, simple kind of sentences, try to really establish this collaborative and kind of help focused model versus kind of rushing in or doing anything or overwhelming kind of any kind of stimulus, that type of stuff. I feel like the training was pretty good just as far as the basics kind of crisis communication goes. And I guess it was more for resolving the incident kind of in the meantime. I feel like as far as just kind of calming the crisis down in that kind of pivotal moment, I feel like the training's pretty good for that. It's some of the other stuff, like I felt like we're not even sure what to communicate at the hospital as far as what happened. Some of those missing pieces, some of the lack of understanding of the healthcare system, what information exactly needs to get communicated at triage, then again to the emergency physician or to the psych nurse. Is there all these kind of repeat steps? Is it we're kind of then telling the story of maybe somebody's worst moment or their worst day when they've been, acting in a really embarrassing kind of way. Maybe they've been based on whether they've stripped off all their clothes, they've been running down the road, or they've been standing up on a bridge and they've just been living this terrible kind of situation. And then we're recounting that in front of a group of other people, maybe in public, to the triage and their healthcare system to get the information quickly. And it kind of then is leading that person into more distress. And then, just kind of a little tricky piece. So I think even just education around best understanding how the healthcare system works, why we need to sort of communicate what information is going to help.
If something happens in your city, do they call it like it's become clear that it's a mental health issue? It's a bit of a crisis. Do they call you, or are you the only person who does this work in your jurisdiction?
In my jurisdiction, there's two of us working, and there's our 911 uniformed officers are obviously working 24/7. So they're usually the first line. We do have good connections again with our community mental health team, so that sometimes they'll give us a heads up direct. Hey, I'm dealing with this client or patient. I'm really concerned about this information I got from their family. They're really not well. They're probably going to need to go to the hospital. Are you guys able to meet us there? So we'll try to help with those. Or it's usually our patrol officers will go to the call and they'll say, hey, you know what, I'm really not sure about this one. It's kind of not clear cut. Or if we kind of hear it unfolding at the same time, and we're available, we'll go out to support it as well.
Yeah, yeah. There's a bit of a team, and like how do you find the perceptions of people with mental illness for police officers on the front line? I imagine there's a swath of officers who are like, this is I don't know how to deal with this. I'm uncomfortable with this. What do I do here? I'm sure some are comfortable with it, but what do you find? Like, do officers complain about it? Are they okay with it? Is it a disruption in their schedule? Like how do they perceive those in the front line with a persistent mental illness?
Yeah, I think they're challenging, and like you said, yeah, it's a huge range. We certainly have, especially with newer officers. It looks like I think there's just with greater education, training, awareness, even coming up now through the school system and that kind of stuff. They're coming in with, yeah, quite frankly, I'm amazed at some of the sort of the literacy, especially of some of the newer officers kind of coming in. But there's still a range, some join and they had conceptions that they'd be chasing down hardened criminals and gang members and that kind of stuff. And then to end up, some days, 90% of their day on the streets, kind of social work, picking up sort of some of the cracks of some of the social ills in kind of society where people have fallen through, both through homelessness, serious mental illness, drug addiction, and feeling kind of helpless and powerless to manage these situations that feel far beyond their scope of response. Then there's certainly some frustration for sure. And then especially on the days where the hospitals are very busy and then they're waiting those extended times, or even just sometimes with some of our partners too, is even if there's a medical need, just long waits for our ambulance personnel to come work because they're so short staffed and overrun with calls.
So then the new recruits, are they surprised that this is what policing is? I don't know if it's always been like this. I imagine there's been an increase, but are they surprised when they get onto the front line and there is a lot of social work and there is a lot of de-escalation and they're not like running and gunning gangsters?
I think there's some are definitely surprised, and some coming from other areas too. Some even we've had some officers transfer over from some bigger cities where they felt like they were responding to a wider range of different types of calls, and then in our municipality, just seeing a high percentage of specifically the social kind of mental health calls. It's definitely an eye opener for some, and just to see, especially for depending on people's life backgrounds coming in, just how eye opening it is to see the level of kind of just misery that some people are living in, that they're so paranoid and they're so fearful that that their furniture and their houses are being bugged and surveilled by the CIA, the FBI. It's always American agencies, by the way. It's I guess that's how that works. But that they don't even have furniture in their house and they're like sleeping on the floor. They can't even trust their food. They think there might be poisons or toxins that people are putting in their foods and stuff, and they're just really living in these just really unfortunate circumstances. And I think that takes a toll on people just going day in, day out without feeling like that there's a good solve or an easy solve for these calls.
So let's talk about then the Mental Health Act. I mean, there's different provinces, different states are more restrictive or more like conservative. Some are more on the liberal, and that's not political, conservative or liberal. Let's call it liberal as in granting the utmost rights to the patient or the individual. On the conservative side, it would be more like the state or the physician or the officer has decision-making power over that individual. There's problems with that, and do you think that we are too restrictive? Do you think we are too liberal? Do you think that we ought to have, as caregivers, officers, psychiatrists, physicians, do you think we ought to have more power when it comes to trying to help people in these difficult situations. There would be some that say that the system that you're in British Columbia it's too draconian, like it restricts rights too much, and that jurisdictions like Ontario don't restrict rights enough. And the whole argument is it's a difficult one. What are your opinions on it? Like, what do you see the cracks in the Mental Health Act? What do you see working with the Mental Health Act?
Yeah, it's so hard because some of the stories that, again, a lot of the people that I'm working with are kind of on the extreme end. They've had likely some version of untreated mental illness to a degree for a long time, or they're just not consistent with kind of treatment. So they're just really often in crisis. And when they're in crisis, they sometimes hurt themselves, or they're violent and aggressive towards other people. And that's certainly a very small percentage of the population, and not saying that, people with mental illness are in any way violent or anything like that, but just the percentage of the population that we deal with and get called to are. And then on the flip side of that, see cases where people finally do get into care, some version of a long-term care that's treating both their mental health and addictions. And some literally that I can remember from my patrol 911 days, 16 years ago, dealing with continually in crisis, smashing out windows, throwing things onto their road, running down the hallway, just continuously very aggressive, usually intoxicated, just drinking or high on drugs, also suffering with mental illness, and a constant strain on their neighbors, their families, on all the first responder resources. And finally getting to that place through a mix of really good coaching and collaboration from their mental health team, and a slight push, maybe just a readiness for some change, getting into care. And one client just getting out after 10 months in a facility and doing super well. And probably the first period in 20 years of sobriety, of treated mental health, and just a whole different person. And knowing that that's possible for people, that if maybe sometimes with a slight push or a decision maker saying, hey, let's give this person a chance and let's get them into a stabilized kind of facility for a period of time, some sort of higher level of care beyond just the first line kind of hospital. It gives people a chance, and it seems like it can work.
Do you see a lot of it, or a good bulk of it, as driven by substances? The reason I ask that is because the Mental Health Act, it's quite restrictive on substance use. And I've seen cases in individuals who I believe very strongly have no control over their ability to stop drinking or stop using fentanyl. I've seen severe enough cases to say that is not that person's decision. No one would want to choose to drink 40 ounces of vodka every day. And so we talk about choice when it comes to addiction. There's a number of cases where I don't believe it's a choice. I believe that is an illness where that person is purely addicted. And I'm sure you see the same situations. And the Mental Health Act is quite restrictive in terms of keeping those individuals against their will, such that you can try and treat that addiction. Do you see a lot of this as being driven by addictions, or is it the system? Like, what are the key drivers of the severe mental illness that you're seeing on the front line?
Yeah, huge aspect. And that's been those are some of the trickiest ones to deal with, especially when people are in the chronic, just a run for several years, specifically with crystal meth and drug-induced psychosis. And then when there would be some clearing of the drugs from the system, and there'd be some settling of those symptoms, no longer having hallucinations, no longer having some of the kind of the overt symptoms, then people were getting immediately released kind of from the hospital, like you said, because there weren't those abilities to continue to hold people past that point. And then immediately, as soon as they were released, the same cycle would happen. It'd just be happening over and over and over again. And there's no way somebody wants to live like that. Like you said, literally, taking their nails and clawing what they believe are like bugs inside their arms out of their bodies and stuff. Like it'd be hard pressed to say somebody is making an informed choice to live that way. So, I think that's a huge gap and a continuing source of frustration is especially on the addiction side and drug psychosis side, or the alcoholism side as well, that people are drinking themselves to death, really.
Well, and meth and crack are so difficult, and I don't know if lawmakers or policymakers know the nuance of that horrific drug. As you know, how it works is you do meth, you become psychotic to the point where you have to intervene, and you bring that individual maybe to the hospital, and typically within 3 to 5 days, that person will have cleared, quote unquote, and they're no longer psychotic and they're feeling pretty good. So there's no recourse for the medical system. Hook them up with outpatient resources, try and lead them in the right direction to not using this super drug that is highly addictive and entirely destructive. And then that individual is feeling good and they might go onto the street and use again. That pattern is seen time and time again. And again, the Mental Health Act is restrictive on what you can do as a practitioner or an officer. There would some that say, of course, that the Mental Health Act is too restrictive on the rights and liberties of those with severe and persistent mental illness. Like, we're taking too many of individuals who are at risk or at harm. They're taking their rights away. We hear often you have the right to be psychotic if you do have a condition like schizophrenia or if you use crystal meth. It's a tough discussion. I don't know, since a lot of the historical research on the institutions that were defunded throughout the 1970s and the early 80s typically would house, and you could argue, take care of people who had the most severe and persistent mental illnesses. And there's a very well understood thread and arc that so many of those individuals who would have otherwise been, quote unquote, in an institution are now in penitentiaries. Yeah. And is that better for our society and those individuals and their quality of life? I highly doubt it. I don't know the answers. It's a really difficult discussion, and you're on the front lines of it every single day.
Yeah, it's interesting. I still remember hearing, had worked in a city jail just before starting my policing career, and I remember hearing from somebody that said that their time at our big provincial psychiatric center was called Riverview, and they talked about when they lived there that was the best time in their life, that they had a community there, they had people there, they had kind of a structure, a routine. And since then, they were just continually out on the streets and using drugs, continually arrested for whatever property crimes, other crimes and stuff that they were committed, and just felt like they were in this indefinite cycle that, wasn't the case back from their time at Riverview. So, it's just interesting.
How common is your role? Like, the need is there, the addiction and severe mental health is on the street, homelessness is intermingled there, and insecure housing. And how many police departments have somebody like you who is doing that work? Is this now commonplace?
Yeah, it's absolutely commonplace. So when I started, there was sort of a number of programs that have been in existence across Canada with a nurse police co-responder car since probably since the 80s. Some of the bigger cities, Toronto, Vancouver, Surrey, some of these cities have had kind of programs for a long time. And then it was more the mid-sized or smaller cities and municipalities that didn't have the kind of the dedicated resources for mental health response. And then when I started about 10 years ago in our department, since then, most municipalities now have at least a representative. Some have full-time, some have 2 spots, 3 spots, some have entire units of 5 officers, bigger stuff. So it's really, but every municipality seems to have some version now of somebody plugged in and focusing and specializing on mental health.
You must enjoy the work, like you made that transition voluntarily. Do you? I mean, you must find it stressful too. What are the like? Tell me about the stressors of that job. If I do an emerge psychiatry shift, people are brought into the hospital, and in some ways, some of the management is already decided. Like we know that we want to line them up with inpatient hospitalization or outpatient resources, or that they need medication. I imagine that on the front line, there's a different level of stress. Do you find it to be a stressful job?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different coming from the front line, from shift work, from kind of 911 response to everything across the board. I think that had its own kind of set of stressors. The mental health focused one, more of kind of a squeeze sometimes. I feel the squeeze from both the kind of the healthcare system sometimes, and from our patrol police officers really wanting to see resolutions to some of the people that they're dealing with, and really wanting to see and want to see people helped and doing better and that kind of stuff.
That's the squeeze from the officer side?
Yeah. And some of that sometimes, or if they're waiting at hospitals, wanting to see less time at the hospital and stuff. So kind of just that pressure on to kind of make things happen and move forward for them. And then sometimes on the other side, just feeling like, why are you bringing these people here? These people.
That's the squeeze from the hospital side.
Yeah.
They're like, well, yeah.
Yeah. And there's a huge mix right now, especially with the proliferation of some meth and some of the other ones. So there just does seem to be a lot more violence and aggression. And for sure, our healthcare staff and our psych nurses and stuff are feeling that in the hospitals, in the psych wards and stuff, and just feeling like their role is, their job is kind of unsafe now. And why is this sort of really erratic person kind of being brought in? Like that they're seeing kind of, this person should be in jail, or, they're exhibiting these behaviors or making these threats. They're not respected from staff there. And just kind of that squeeze where sometimes we don't know exactly where to be. Where's the best for people, or maybe they haven't committed specifically a criminal offense, or only really recourse is to take them to the hospital, but they can be unwanted there as well, and just trying to kind of figure through those out. And then just the volume of requests, it's kind of there's a personal kind of guilt sometimes for just not being able to help more people, not be able to get out to more calls, do more for people in crisis, because they're suffering. And
do you find it weird sometimes to come back to like your non-work life? I'd imagine that you see some wild things at work, and then you come back and you watch a football game, and then like you're like, these are 2 very different realities. I'm always amazed at how weird the job is in healthcare, and the extreme forms of living and surviving and life that we see. And in some ways, it's a blessing. We are very privileged to be able to help people when they are in extreme distress, or have been living in extreme duress for months, even in your case. Does it ever hit you like, man, this is a wild job? Like, does that ever just slap you in the face sometimes?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. There's moments where just things that you just never expect to ever see people doing, just to each other. Some of the levels of harm people do to each other, or just some of the things when people are just so unwell. Remember, somebody was like cooking their own hair on a stove, and it just smeared things all over the walls and stuff. And it was just a really
Oh,
unfortunate situation of like, how did this person get to such a state that, yeah, they're living like this. And those are, yeah, tough to kind of reconcile sometimes. Then coming home and just, into a comfortable, warm environment, or, just driving home, and then somebody has to wait 5 more minutes because they missed a light or something like that. And they're just absolutely kind of losing their mind in their car, that it's the end of the world, that they're, 5 minutes later for something that, yeah, those things can be tough to reconcile for sure.
do you like we talk about PTSD and firefighters, paramedics, um, and obviously officers, police officers, and there's very comparatively so there's very little PTSD amongst physicians and emerge docs. There is some, of course, but the stats would say it's much lower. And I always talk about how the presentation of that form of extreme is so much more controlled in the environments that we see it in. So if I see somebody who has been brought off the street because they were, I don't know, cooking their hair, which sounds like unbelievable, and you go as an officer and see them in their home where there's pictures of children, and they're watching a show that you watch, or they have the same chair as you, or whatever, like real life environments. That's where I think it triggers these really traumatic situations for officers. And then they get brought into the hospital where we kind of see them in the same environment, and we can distinguish those two environments. We can say, oh, this is like the hospital world that I live in, and I see patients and a psych emerge. And then this is the world that I just live like a decent, comfortable life in. You must work with officers about this sort of thing, and try and help them through these sort of traumatic things that they see in the things that they're working through in the real world.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at that. Some of the controlled, although still seeing, really serious injuries and still dealing with the families and stuff in a little bit more of a controlled environment versus the actual kind of the front line out in people's homes and with their families, and sort of the freshness, kind of rawness of some of those aspects. And yeah, those are difficult. And that, was a big driver for me, kind of my two streams of interest work-wise in mental health, both been responding to people in the community and then supporting other police officers. And that kind of started early in my career, where I saw a friend of mine and a colleague just really struggling with some work-related things, some difficult calls and incidents that they had gone to, and then some personal life factors mixed in, going through a divorce and just really struggling. And I don't think we talked about it much back then, and there just weren't the same resources available and the same understanding. And so wanting kind of, remember at that time, there was a couple of colleagues and myself just kind of forming like a mini kind of peer support unit around this person, and just doing our best to kind of support this person kind of through that difficult time. And that really just drove me to want to better understand mental health, better understand people struggling with depression, anxiety, PTSD, that kind of stuff. What can we do to support them? And then that actually led for me to go back to my master's in counseling psych, and kind of get a better grasp on how do we kind of better support some of our colleagues kind of going through this stuff. And I think one of the main ways is through that peer connection, is through peer support. So officers trained in critical incident peer support actually getting ready to prep to teach a course on that this week with a number of new officers. So yeah, excited just how much more interest and open people are to that whole program, officers supporting other officers. And I think that's a big one, is just people sitting down who've been to some of these calls, have experienced maybe some of these things themselves, and hopefully who also have some credibility, have worked in different kind of roles in the organization department, that they've been frontline, or maybe some of them have been on, drug units or tactical teams, and they're open to talking about some of their own struggles. They're talking about what's helped them, what's worked for them, and really kind of walking alongside people as they're going through stuff is that seems to be huge for people.
The peer support is one of the solutions, you believe?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not the only aspect, for sure. And I know, it's a grassroots one, and people like to see sometimes more support at higher levels. They want to see executive support. They don't necessarily want to just see it from peers and colleagues after difficult calls, or when they're going through kind of stressful times, but have really seen a lot of success with that programs. And even for myself, I remember, again, it wasn't a formal peer support team, but after I was struggling with a call, I had been assigned as a primary negotiator on a call, on a hostage taking call in the Lower Mainland, where unfortunately both the person that had the suspect and the person that they had taken hostage ultimately both died, and were died during this incident. And I struggled with that afterwards, and not even really realizing it, because I wasn't able to get negotiations going that night. The person wasn't picking up their phone. We were trying over the loud hailer. We were trying various different techniques, and ultimately they weren't receptive to any communication. So without having that connection, there wasn't sort of much we could do. But felt a lot of guilt. I felt a lot of guilt for the tactical team there going in trying a hostage rescue, and ultimately, the hostage dying during this event. Just dealing with the family. The family had been really supportive through the night and just helping us with a lot of information on trying to kind of help inform negotiations and that kind of thing. And it wasn't until I was back at work a couple of days later, where I had a few colleagues just kind of in the next area over, just as we were kind of walking over for coffee in the morning, and they were just saying like, "Hey, you don't seem like yourself. Are you doing okay?" And I remember, like, I thought, I had it together. I'd been, I'd done my master's in this. I'd been on the critical incident peer support team for 5 years at that point. I'd done sort of hundreds of follow-ups and check-ins with other people. I'd kind of given the spiel. I thought I was kind of aware enough within myself, but it really kind of hit home where other people started to notice that I was just kind of down. I wasn't sort of talking as much. I seemed a little bit kind of out of it. And that kind of just drove home for me, and just feeling that also just that people noticed and cared. And then people started to share all sorts of stories and events that they had been involved in that I didn't know about, and how it had impacted them. And just kind of gave me that permission. People talked about how, hey, you're always the one looking out for everybody else, and you just went through this really tough call, and how are you doing? And just kind of, made me realize, like, none of us are immune to any of this stuff, and just a caring group of colleagues who've gone through that stuff, who notice, see, are there to kind of listen, helped me a lot to kind of recognize that, you know what, I am impacted, and I need to take some steps here to work through it.
All right, I appreciate you telling your story. I think it's so interesting that you had experienced this after you had some of the training and felt like you had it all together, went through a really difficult call and circumstance, and needed your peers to pull you in and say, hey, you don't look like yourself. And it's also exciting to see that you've been able to develop some of these peer supports in a very busy police unit. So yeah, thank you for all the work you do. Thanks for joining us today and telling your story about this. Yeah, well, I'd love to continue to follow your story and how you developed this program and all the work you're doing. Hugely needed area. You are the frontline psychiatrists and help us out in the hospitals so much. So yeah, thank you just genuinely for all the work you do and in joining the pod today.
Likewise, appreciate it. Thank you.